So Al, all things have a season, and ministry appointments begin, and ministry appointments always have a conclusion. Whether that conclusion be from the death of a pastor, the retirement of a pastor, or sometimes the local board is no longer desiring to continue forward with a staff pastor position, or the conference has decided to stop, to end an appointment of a senior pastor at a church. So we have these two interviews. They're both this kind of exit interview.
Sure.
When there's conference initiated change, and when there's a local board initiated the change.
Sure.
And there's probably some nuance beyond those two. But can you talk to us a little bit about who and how someone's coming into these types of exit interviews, and give some of the more detail about the why the MEG board would be interviewing a person at this point?
Right. If a ministry leader is functioning with the title of pastor anywhere in our system, then when there's a transition for that pastor, the MEG board is to have a relational role in this transition. The idea being like nobody is appointed to pastor a church unless the MEG board has done an approval for ministry interview or done an ordination interview and then the person was appointed. So if a pastor who's appointed to lead a church is going to transition from that church, we want that person to feel supported and guided by the MEG board in that transition. So that's the first category, a senior pastor who's leaving a church for whatever reason. The second category is when a staff pastor is leaving a church. We want the MEG board to have a relational role, an oversight role in this. So the way a person becomes a staff pastor is when the senior pastor and the board of the local church make a decision to hire that person. That's the local church's decision. But that church cannot give that staff member the title of pastor unless there's a MEG interview that approves them for ministry as a pastor. So since the MEG board gives the title of pastor to a local church staff member, if the local church if the person is going to conclude at the local church, then the MEG board should also do an exit interview with the staff pastor as well. So those are the two categories, senior pastors or lead pastors in transition and staff pastors in transition.
Okay. And so when this pastor in either place comes before the MEG to be interviewed as that current ministry role is concluding, what are some of the questions and what's the conversation look like for the MEG board
Sure.
with this interviewee?
Yeah. Of course, the MEG board usually has some advance notification of the reason for the change. Generally, that comes through the regional superintendent, the conference superintendent, to the regional MEG chair, and then there's some debrief. But whatever might be the prior debrief the MEG board has, we always want the MEG board to start the conversation with the pastor in transition this way. So talk to us about all the events that has led up to your making this transition. We ask it as a very neutral question, like just tell us about all that's led up to this transition. So that's the first part of a three-part conversation. The second part of the conversation has to do with asking the person to talk about what you're learning and what you're hearing from God in the midst of this transition. We just really want to see what is the work of Jesus in this person's life during this time of transition, and we want to point the person to reflect on that. What am I learning? How am I being impacted and changed by this? So then the third part of the three-part conversation is, what's next? Because we have a conviction that Jesus has a lifelong commitment and a lifelong call for people. And so we want to have a conversation about what's next in your life in ministry after this appointment ends.
Sure. Good. So So then in the interview, I could imagine a pastor going through the transition having maybe some questions for the MEG board. What sorts of things might the pastor want to ask the MEG board about?
Well, because some change is initiated by the pastor, sometimes a pastor comes to the conference leadership and says, I'm going to go a different direction, whatever that might be. And so sometimes the pastor, in a very positive way, has a sense of a different way to go. But sometimes the change is initiated by the decision of the conference, that a superintendent might say to a pastor, we think it's time for a change. Or the local church board might say to a staff pastor, we're going to go in a different direction, type of thing. So the need of the pastor in the exit interview might be to really get perspective on how to relate to this change. Particularly, it can be complicated if it's a painful or challenging transition for the pastor. We want to be really sensitive to that. So the unasked question sometimes that the MEG board has to grapple with is, what is the proper way I should look at to this change? What's the proper way that I should relate to this and to the people involved with this?
Yeah. So at the conclusion of the interview, what is the outcomes? What are the potential decisions that can be made by the MEG board in that interview?
Well, we first of all want to do everything we can to create a positive trajectory for the pastor in transition. We want to make sure that no matter what the nature of the initiation of this change, that this person is moving ahead with a sense of spiritual connection with Jesus and spiritual direction from Jesus, and that this person is going to land in the next thing with a sense of calling and a sense of effectiveness. So there are times that we have counsel that we give. There are times that the pastor in transition has to sort through really complicated thoughts and emotions about the interview. And we want to give gentle redirection if we have concerns about the way the pastor is viewing this, or how the pastor might be acting in relationships in response to this. So there might be some redirection we give, saying we really encourage you to no longer talk in this way to these people, or we'd like to encourage you to really take some time to heal and then look for other opportunities.
Yeah. Great. Well, that's good guidance, Al. And there's more information and some additional sample questions in the MEG board interviews guide. And so if you check that document out, we want you to review. You'll want to review that prior to any of these types of interviews.
Very good.